competitive and households are not weighed down by rising costs, I commend this bill to the House.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. I call the Honourable Member Moana Maki.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I think the Minister has forgotten why we're doing all this. He's talked a lot about carbon costs and a lot about the cost of business and a lot about the cost to industry. He hasn't talked at all about the cost to the environment and the cost to our planet of doing nothing. And I think that the government's completely forgotten why we have an emissions trading scheme in the first place. And frankly, if this is the kind of legislation that we're going to be passing in this House, we might as well get rid of it, because we don't have an emissions trading scheme. The emissions trading scheme we have in place is all sectors, all gases. That's how it was designed. It doesn't work if all sectors and all gases aren't in the scheme. And when 50% of this country's emissions, which come from the agricultural sector, are excluded from the scheme, it simply doesn't work. And we're seeing the impact in the forestry sector at the moment. We have a lot of carbon foresters who would like to be able to sell the units that they get from growing their forest to someone, but half of the country's emitters are not in the scheme. So the market for their credits is not there. And we are going to be facing massive liabilities in the future when, and I believe there will be a successor agreement to Kyoto. When that will be, I don't know, and I know that the Minister is part of those negotiations and has a decision to make very shortly as to whether we enter into the European second commitment period or whether we enter into a voluntary period with non-binding targets. That's a decision the government has to make, and we await that decision with bated breath. But the fact is, if we're not going to do this properly, then why are we putting everyone through the pain of doing it at all? Because this further undermines the scheme that Labor put in place when we were in government. It further undermines any efforts. I know Jackie Dean's really pleased that we're now not doing anything about climate change. Really pleased that we're not taking our climate change commitments seriously. Does Jackie Dean realise how much exporters in her electorate rely on our clean green branding? Does she realise the value of that branding to this country? Because if she does, then she should be very concerned about legislation like this added on top of a pile of policies which are consistently undermining the very branding that we rely on to remain internationally competitive, as the Minister said in the first place. And that's one of my biggest concerns about this government and about this piece of legislation, is the say one thing, do another approach of the national government. They go out there and they tout our clean, green, 100% pure credentials. John Key, when he went on Hard Talk on the BBC when he was in the UK, got absolutely done over when some actual hard investigative journalism questions were put to him about just how clean and green New Zealand really is, and he couldn't answer the questions. And Labor says we should actually start walking the talk and living that brand rather than just paying lip service to it, which is what the national government is doing. And they've relied on an economic downturn to provide a reduction in the growth in emissions. But our emissions have continued to grow. And when questioned at Select Committee, when Minister Grosser was asked when are New Zealand's gross greenhouse gas emissions projected to peak, he didn't know. He had to come back to us, and the answer was never. So instead of actually having a scheme in place that starts to reduce our gross greenhouse gas emissions, we don't. We have one that's going to allow them to continue to grow and is not putting any carbon price at all on the very people who we want to drive that behaviour change. The very people we want to drive the behaviour change we need if we're going to, one, actually take our commitments seriously internationally in terms of global climate change, and two, if we're going to protect the very brand that has been built up over decades. And I tell you what, reputations are hard-earned, but they're very quickly lost. And this national government, with its single-minded focus on oil and gas exploration whilst putting in no support for low-carbon or renewable technologies, and now with pieces of legislation like this, are doing a very good job of undermining that brand, which is so important to our economy. And I want to give an example of the kind of do as I say, not as I do, contradictory statements that we're getting out of the national government. Now, Minister Grosser is very very keen on promoting his involvement in a group called the Friends of Fossil Fuel Subsidy Reform Scheme. Now, this is a group that has very laudable, very laudable objectives, which is to go around the country and talk to countries which have subsidies in place for high carbon industries, for fossil fuels, and talk to them about the benefits of getting rid of those subsidies, which are often costly to the governments that provide them, but also very costly to the government. Now, on the MFAT website, if you go to the MFAT website, there's a whole page on this particular scheme, and it's all very grandiose. It's got quotes in big fonts, and it's on a very, appropriately environmentally friendly green background. And the quote from Minister Grosser is this. He says, quote, "It is completely incoherent for the world to be tentatively coordinating actions to put a price on carbon while simultaneously massively subsidising consumption of carbon," end quote. Agreed. Very good quote. So why then, Minister, are you introducing a piece of legislation into the House which entrenches for perpetuity, forever, subsidies that come from emitters of carbon? Because we have this 2-for-1 surrender obligation that the government put in place after the last election, where basically for every 2 tonnes that are emitted, the emitters only have to surrender 1 unit instead of the 2. So that's halved their costs. And the review panel that the Minister referred to said that that should be phased out and gotten rid of because it's expensive. And instead of doing that, the Minister who goes around the world telling other countries that we shouldn't have these subsidies has just entrenched them in legislation forever. Forever. It says maintain the 1-for-2 surrender obligation after 2012 without specifying an end date in legislation. Not only that, but the government also subsidises and has tax credits for oil and gas exploration, for people who want to engage in that activity. As I said, nothing for those who work in the renewables area in terms of that kind of assistance. How, again, can the Minister hold his head up high, going preaching to other countries that they should get rid of subsidies for fossil fuel extraction, for fossil fuel subsidisation, when we're doing exactly the same thing in New Zealand? It is this kind of activity, is this kind of contradictory behaviour that does New Zealand no favours on the international stage. And I've talked to a number of people recently who've said that New Zealand's standing internationally has declined dramatically since this government took over. And that's something we should be concerned about. Because the government used to accuse us of being world leaders in climate change when we were in government. And we thought, yeah, we're trying to take a stand, we're trying to be principled on this. Now, John Key, when he was elected, said, yeah, we're not going to be world leaders, but let's be fast followers. We'll be fast followers instead. Well, what we've actually become is apathetic spectators. That's what we are, standing on the sideline, waiting for Australia to do something, so then we might or might not decide what to do. And it has been noticed that New Zealand, the clean green country at the bottom of the world that people respect and look up to internationally, our reputation is in sharp decline. And members of this House should not be in any doubt of how dangerous that is to our economy. And I want to come back to the issue of agriculture, Mr. Speaker, because the Minister could have done something very simple. The Minister, if the issue with agriculture is price, is the cost to farmers, and not the principle of bringing agriculture into the scheme, which is what we're always told, then bring them in, but don't put any price obligation on them, but bring them into the scheme, so that they're in the scheme, they know that in the future they will face a price cost. But why can't they come in? The government can subsidise them 100% if that's what they decide. We wouldn't agree with that. But that's what they could do. And I remember that back in 2009, John Key was telling agriculture they had to come into the scheme or risk the loss of export markets. He was quite adamant. He said the cost to agriculture is about $3,000 a year, and that was when the carbon price was much higher. It's very low now. The cost would actually be minimal to bring some of these people in. You could argue that this is a good time to bring people in terms of if they're worried about the cost. But I want to raise one very important point, which is that I don't think you'll find a single farmer who will say that getting rid of the subsidies in the 80s was a bad idea. They hated it at the time. They absolutely hated it. But they had to then become innovative and responsive. They had to respond to market signals. They had to respond to consumer demands. They had to be aware internationally of what was going on. That is what has made our farmers the best in the world. That is what has made them the most innovative, because they haven't been shielded from these kind of market signals. And so I'm stunned as to why the agricultural sector and the national government would now argue that we should bring back subsidies, that we should now blunt those market signals, that we should now shield the agricultural sector from the very signals that in the past they have responded to phenomenally, which has made them the greatest farming industry in the world? And I would like an answer to that question from the next national speaker. Thank you.
I call the Honourable Minister